Hello, my name is Jillian Amodio, and today I am here to talk about the burden of sexual shame and the freedom that comes when we reclaim our power and replace shame with truth. When I was 12, I had my first suicidal ideation. That feeling of hopelessness was fueled by shame. And interestingly enough, is the fact that spirituality based on false narratives is what brought me to that low. But spirituality based in truth is what actually ended up saving me. Now, as a child, I desperately wanted to be a nun. I craved a quiet, pious life of reflection. I craved purpose and safety and structure. But even more than all of that, what I really craved was salvation or the promise of salvation. And all through childhood, to secure this salvation, I relied on rituals and superstitions to keep myself and the people I loved safe, both in my earthly life, but also in my eventual spiritual afterlife. I never stepped on sidewalk cracks because it might mortally wound my mother. I never walked under ladders to avoid hardship. And every night before falling asleep, I recited the names of everyone I loved alongside the Lord's Prayer just to make sure I kept them safe. I counted the stairs every time I walked up or down a flight, and I never left the house or entered a car without making the sign of a cross. Now, these routines created a false sense of safety for me, but they also fed a growing sense of anxiety and fueled my sense of shame when I fell short or forgot. And the older I got, the harder it became to feel certain that I was doing the right things and avoiding the wrong ones. As I got older, life got more complicated, and puberty made everything worse. I knew, for instance, that bodies were shameful, and I knew that I wasn't supposed to have sex, I wasn't supposed to masturbate, I wasn't supposed to engage in lustful behaviors or view pornography. I knew these words, I knew the rules, but I didn't know what any of it actually meant, so I didn't really know how to go about making sure I wasn't doing it. And more than that, the lack of knowledge was one thing, but I was too ashamed to even ask for guidance. In middle school, I started piecing together fragments of understanding by overhearing conversations of my peers. I had been signed out of sex education class, and my family said they would teach me at home, but that conversation never really came. I began to wonder as I was overhearing these conversations if even just overhearing them was sinful. I might not be participating, but curiosity itself felt dangerous. And as my curiosity grew, so did my shame. I wondered if hearing these things secondhand was as dangerous to my soul as secondhand smoke was to your lungs. The shame showed up in many ways. A boy once asked me to a middle school dance, and I felt like I was doing something wrong just by being innocently desired. So I panicked and I cried and I threw up on his shoes. In a school play, I had to hold a boy's hand and pretend to kiss him. And I was so naive that after the play, even though I loved theater, it was an escape for me. I panicked and broke down in tears because I was so worried that I'd accidentally had sex. In eighth grade, I got my period, and at the time, I thought I was dying. I believed my body was finally being punished for my sinfulness. I sobbed on the floor of the school bathroom, begging God for forgiveness, wondering how much time I had left on the earth to correct my wrongdoings, and I stayed there until a peer came in and found me sobbing and was nervous and didn't know what to do and got the nurse. The nurse came down and simply told me, "You're becoming a woman." Shortly after that, I went to a special confession that my church was offering. And it was a chance to not only have my original sin forgiven, which happened not very often at all, um, but also, the actual sin, the sins that I committed in my daily life. And if I were to receive this special blessing of having my original sin and my actual sin forgiven, that meant something really special would happen. It meant that I could go to heaven and skip purgatory altogether upon death. So during that confession, I admitted everything I had done that week, from lying to not going to bed on time to even the shameful admission that I had viewed pornography. Now, what really happened was that I'd walked past the men's underwear aisle in Macy's with my grandmother that week, and in my ignorance and lack of understanding, I was convinced that that counted as viewing porn. This is the perfect example of how ignorance doesn't protect children, it terrifies them. So after confession, I knelt in the church pews. I recited my penance. I prayed the rosary, and I promised God that I would live a life of purity and devotion from there on out. When I stood up, I felt light. I felt hopeful, but that feeling, it didn't last. As soon as I stepped outside of that church, I realized something terrifying. There was absolutely no way I could live the rest of my life without sinning. I was only 12 years old. So, standing beside that busy road in front of the church, that's where I first contemplated suicide. I thought, if I just run into traffic right now, I'll be hit by a car, I'll die, and in my current state of freedom from sin, I would go straight to heaven. I wouldn't have to worry about eternal damnation. But just as quickly as that thought came, another one followed. I remember that I had been taught suicide was a sin too. Just like that, that brief hope that I felt was dissolved and replaced once again by shame. As I advanced to high school, my understanding of sex and relationships still lagged way behind my peers. Every interaction with boys felt confusing and wrong and shameful, and I had no framework for understanding things like boundaries or consent, and that really set me up for failure. When my science grade, for instance, slipped, I had been a straight A student, and I couldn't let that happen. My parents were so mad. A male teacher offered to help me after school, and I expected tutoring. Instead, I found myself wearing short skirts and crawling on the floor, exercising, the classroom turtle, while he watched. I knew that something about this felt wrong, but I didn't know how to question authority, especially male authority. So I complied. I lost my dignity, but I kept my A. A few months later, I was sexually assaulted at a bowling alley. The next day, when I tried to explain what happened using words I barely had the vocabulary for and certainly lacked the confidence to use, I was blamed. You're a whore, is what I was told. At 16, I had sex for the first time, and I didn't even fully understand what was happening, and I kind of just dissociated until it was over. And after that, well, sex simply continued happening. It was something that happened to me, not necessarily with me fully involved, if that makes sense. And then even more things started to happen when I discovered, for instance, masturbation. I discovered it accidentally one morning while leaning against the bathroom counter doing my makeup, and that sudden pleasure shocked me. Curiosity followed, but so did, of course, crushing, shame, and guilt. And each time I brought myself to orgasm, I then collapsed into sobs afterward and begged God for forgiveness. At 16 years old, fearing pregnancy almost as much as I feared eternal damnation, I took myself to Planned Parenthood. Outside the clinic, there were protesters holding graphic signs and praying for my soul. And again, I felt that familiar flush of shame rising. What was I doing? Was I not supposed to be here? This must be wrong. Inside, there was a nurse, and I don't remember her name, but I remember she had a pixie haircut, and she greeted me with such kindness and gentleness. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not as a sinner, not as a flawed being, but as a scared and uninformed child. I told her all about my painful periods and my fear of pregnancy and my confusion about sex. She prescribed me birth control, but she also educated me, and that is where a shift began to happen. I started to believe that there were truths that I had not yet had access to, and those truths were what began to set me free. Now, change didn't happen overnight. By 18, I married my high school boyfriend. He's now my husband, and we have a great life together. 21, we had our first child, and even then, I was still locked in this cycle of shame. But motherhood, too, began shifting my thinking. I was still deeply Catholic, but some teachings just no longer sat right with me. It didn't sit with my soul. It didn't match who I was or what I really truly felt my values were. And by the time our second child was born, when I was 25, I'd begun to step away from the church. I left my volunteer role at a pro life organization and I began speaking openly about the harm that I saw in rigid ideologies and the shame that they created. I knew that as a mom, I wanted my children to grow up kind and inclusive and accepting, and I wanted them to grow up informed and empowered. I became involved in advocacy work and I founded a mental health group, Moms for Mental Health, and I began writing more, both personal journaling and professionally journalism. I embraced my sexuality, my sensuality, and my own autonomy. I even had a tubal ligation as a means of taking control over my reproductive desires. And I finally, for the first time in my life, began to experience sex as something joyful rather than shameful. I earned a master's degree in social work and became a licensed therapist with certifications in sex therapy and a focus on supporting the LGBTQ community and those recovering from religious trauma and abuse. Today, I still consider myself a very spiritual person, but my beliefs are rooted in compassion rather than fear. My beliefs are rooted in knowledge rather than ignorance. Strict religious adherence once stole my freedom and peace, and it pushed me towards shame and despair. Spirituality, however, brought me back to grace, teaching me to love myself and others with patience, kindness, and acceptance. And as I leave you today, I want to plant a seed that I hope will end the silence around sexual shame. And I encourage you each to root yourself in truth. ROOT, root. R stands for releasing shame. Shame thrives in secrecy, but knowledge dissolves it. Shame is not your burden to bear. O stands for owning your desire for love and intimacy, connection, pleasure, and knowledge. That's not corruption. It's information, and it's valuable, and it's yours. O stands for observe sensation. What makes you feel good? Emotionally, physically, sexually, intellectually? What does it feel like to feel good in all of those capacities? And seek more of that. You deserve it. And finally, T. T means trust. Trust yourself. You are full of wisdom. You are full of light. And you are full of truth. Knowing what I know now, all these years later, if I could kneel next to that little 12-year-old girl in the church pew all those years ago, I would lean over. I would whisper in her ear, your body is not a sin. Your curiosity is not corruption. And your God is not afraid of your humanity, and you need not be either. And I leave you with that today. Thank you.